Okay, good afternoon, everyone, to the second installment of the 2015 Wellick Library Lectures. And to introduce the second one, I'm going to recognize my distinguished colleague, Gabby Schwab, Chair of the Comparative Literature Department. But before turning the podium over to her, I wanted to remind you that tomorrow morning we will begin the first annual Critical Theory Institute conference on the topic, Is Theory Critical? And we will be meeting over in Langston Library tomorrow morning for a special retrospective session. I mean, there's some postcards with details and a few kind of brochures that give you the full outline of the conference. And then in the afternoon, we'll meet in this room beginning at 1:30 on a set of panel discussions around questions that were designed by the Critical Theory Emphasis Committee here at Irvine. And then the last of the three Wellick lectures tomorrow afternoon at 4 in this same room. So without any ado, I will turn it forward to Gabriella.
Okay, after yesterday's fireworks of the brain, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Catherine Malabou's second Wellick lecture. Rather than returning to her academic history and amazing achievements that George van den Abil introduced yesterday, and rather than even attempting to summarize yesterday's lecture, I will focus more generally on some of Catherine Malabou's major challenges to the boundaries of the humanities, if not to what we used to conceive as the boundaries of the human. Given the current urgency of thinking across avidly policed school boundaries, Malabou's challenges come at a good time, which is not to say that it is easy to deal with them. How then can we assess the challenge her work presents? I first met Catherine in 2002 when I invited her as a keynote speaker to a conference I organized as director of the Critical Theory Institute on Derrida Deleuze psychoanalysis. Catherine then presented a lecture titled Polymorphism Will Never Pervert Childhood, which returned to Freud's concept of polymorphous perversity in children that at Freud's time presented a scandalous intervention in child psychology. Malabou then took issue with Deleuze, who insisted that there is no polymorphism by reading first Freud's polymorphism as a deterritorialized state, and then by using medical discourses on the polymorphism of viruses, microbes, and pathogenic bacteria to point to a decided polymorphism in Deleuze's own work. Then she used the so-called polymorphous machine in electronics to ask if it is not such a machine that carries out the transmutation of the polymorphous into what Deleuze and Guattari call the polyvocal. This was 13 years ago, and we can already trace Malabou's concern with using scientific discourses to explore the question of the boundaries of the human. So we would be wrong to assume, as a superficial look at her work suggests, that Malabou's recent work has moved beyond the concerns of humanistic inquiry. Quite to the contrary. To be sure, Malabou has recently turned to scientific psychology, a discipline that is allegedly profoundly antithetical to the humanities. In yesterday's lecture, she looked at the role of classification and measuring in understanding intelligence. She has turned to neurobiology and the neurosciences, and she's one of the first philosophers who radically forces attention to the brain and its relationship to what we call mind, self, soul, personality, and thinking. But Malabou's challenge is not just to ask scholars in the humanities to take the sciences seriously. Rather, she forces philosophy and philosophical questions into the heart of the sciences and thereby returns them to the humanities. For me, this double challenge produces an almost Beckettian effect, putting our most cherished concepts in quotation marks, so to speak, the mind, the self, the soul, if, as Beckett asks, those notions can still be maintained. So Catherine Malabou returns us to the old philosophies that explore the relationship between the body and the mind, albeit in radically new ways. Like Beckett, Jean-François Lyotard had asked, can thought go on without a body? In her recent book, The New Wounded, From Neurosis to Brain Damage, Malabou asks how the body, and specifically the damaged brain, force us to rethink these old categories of the mind, the self, the soul, but also concepts such as the permanence and continuity of subjectivity and personhood. Is a person who is radically changed by a brain injury still the same person? And if not, how do we deal interpersonally with the loss of the old person? As she states in her introduction, Malabou's work on the brain was inspired by the loss of her beloved grandmothers to Alzheimer's. In this respect, I would locate her thinking on the brain somewhere between a protective barrier, about which we have heard a lot yesterday, and a profound act of interminable mourning. I want to end with a story my favorite neuropsychologist, Paul Broks, tells in his book, Into the Silent Land. It is the story of Thomas Harvey, the Princeton Hospital's pathologist who was charged with stealing Einstein's brain and living with it well into his 80s in his Princeton basement, not without sending bits and pieces of the brain to prominent neuroscientists. This neuro-Gothic tale about Einstein's brain takes a new turn when a journalist, Michael Paterniti, travels with Harvey and Einstein's brain floating in a Tupperware container to California and admits that holding Einstein's brain, he has fantasies of eating it. Instead, he put, in his own words, Einstein's brain on a pillow and rested his head next to it while sleeping. Why is this story so relevant to Catherine Malabou's core concerns? First, because it addresses our cultural obsession with the hereditary gift of the genius that she traced in her lecture yesterday. But it is relevant in another way as well that is related to Catherine's work on the fantastic in philosophy. Neuro-Gothic tales abound in recent scientific literature, from Oliver Sacks to Paul Broks. There is almost a new primitivism in our fascination with these tales. But if we resist them, the temptation to romanticize them, as Catherine Malabou challenges us to do, that is, if we take them seriously in our explorations of the boundaries of the human, then we need to return them to the humanities and to philosophy. Only a thinking that emerges from the genealogy of the venerable tradition of philosophical inquiry can explore the intensities and affects at the heart of these stories that escape measurement and classification. Only such philosophical thought can make us understand the profound challenges posed to us by the new sciences of the brain and tell us more why the stories that emerge in their wake, including the neuro-Gothic ones, concern us all. We are still a long way from fully grasping the implications of the most scary question Catherine Malabou asks in The New Wounded, quote, "The writing of neurological suffering raises the vertiginous question of the psyche's survival of its own annihilation. It is a paradox that can only come out of the blue brain. And this is the title of Catherine's lecture today. Let us welcome her warmly.
Well, what can I say after such a beautiful and moving introduction? Thank you so much. Okay. So, as I announced yesterday, in the second moment of my trajectory, I intend to expose the shift from the genetic to the epigenetic paradigm that is currently taking place in molecular biology, but also, and this is my contention, in artificial intelligence. This talk is mediation, so it means that it has really a middle function. So in a certain sense, it has no conclusion. It's a very Hegelian structure, like we are in the middle of something. So before we meet with the machine, as I said yesterday, we have to meet with the new brain and with the new definition of intelligence that is brought about by molecular biology today. The epigenetic turn in the history of intelligence is intimately related to the neurobiological revolution that took place in the 80s and revealed that the brain, far from being made of fixed and rigid localizations, is undergoing continuous physical changes and rewirings. The power of neuroplasticity has provoked a very important mutation in the definition of intelligence that challenged and is still challenging all attempts at considering it as innate and genetically determined or predetermined. Such a turn gave way to new definitions of ability, development, and inheritance. This is what I will study in the first moment of today's lecture. My strategy here will be different from yesterday's. Instead of staging a conflict between two camps in the classical form of attack, defense, offensive, defensive, tortoise formation, I intend, and I will go back to the tortoise tomorrow, I intend to make an internal conflict emerge, more exactly, an internal problem, internal to intelligence itself. That's of the appropriation, assimilation, and confiscation of the epigenetic identity and potentialities of the brain by the most recent developments and achievements in artificial intelligence. I take problem here according to the ancient Greek signification, problema, which means literally what lays ahead, what is proposed, and contradictorily means both an obstacle, a stone that is found on a path, and a shield, what one holds in front of oneself to protect oneself. So intelligence here will appear as the paradoxical structure of a dangerous self-protective assemblage. So we won't need a protective shield outside of intelligence. We'll see that intelligence tries to protect itself against its appropriation by the machines, and that it fails in doing so. It will emerge, in other terms, as a problem. Intelligence will emerge, in other terms, as a problem not only in itself, as it wrote yesterday, but also for itself. And again, I'm referring to Hegel's distinction between the in itself and the for itself. I will develop this logic in the form of a self-critique, as I announced yesterday, so it's not this time the anatomy of a war front. My strategy is that of a self-critique, and I will critique some of the arguments developed in my book, What Should We Do with Our Brain? So first of all, I will present on the epigenetic paradigm. The references are innumerable in the scientific community to the profound changes that are currently occurring in molecular biology. To mention only two of these references, we can think of Evelyn Fox-Keller's important talk, Paradigms and Revolutions in Contemporary Biology, delivered in 2013, or of Henri Atlan's book, which I already referred to yesterday, which is called The End of Everything is Genetic, La fin du tout génétique. Let me quote from Atlan. The genetic paradigm is starting to be seriously unsettled. The idea that the totality or essential aspects of the development and functioning of living organisms is determined by a genetic program tends to be gradually replaced by a more complex model that is based on notions of interaction, reciprocal effects between the genetic, whose central role is not denied, and the epigenetic, whose importance we are gradually discovering. This new orientation in the logic of life derives largely from the results of the sequencing of the human genome, which I talked about yesterday, which was so disappointing. On 15 February of 2001, the American scientific journal Nature published the virtually complete sequence of the 3 billion bases of this genome. The result was surprising. The human genome is made up of only 30,000 genes, which is very few. And furthermore, it appears that genes only make up 5% of our genome. Assembled in bunches and clusters, they are separated by vast expanses of so-called gene desert, made up of DNA called junk or repetitive, that is non-coding. According to studies, this non-coding DNA accounts for a quarter or a third of the totality of the genome. This means that within chromosomes, there are long DNA sequences which, according to current understanding, do not appear to match the genes and cannot be given any particular function. So the sequencing of the genome did not offer the expected revelations. On the contrary, it indicated the weakening of genetic determinism, which marked the emergence of the biological post-genomic era. The epigenetic turn or post-genomic biology are one and the same. Coming back to our problem, we now definitely know that there is no gene for intelligence. Epigenetics is a science that is currently dramatically transforming all previous, that is essentially genetic, conception of inheritance. This branch of molecular biology studies the relations between genes and the individual features they produce. In other terms, the relation between the genotype and the phenotype. Derived from epigenesis, the term epigenetics was initially a neologism created in 1940 by the British biologist Conrad Waddington. I quote from Waddington. Some years ago, I introduced the word epigenetics, derived from the Aristotelian word epigenesis, which had more or less passed into disuse, as a suitable name for the branch of biology which studies the causal interactions between genes and their products, which bring the phenotype into being. Epigenetic mechanisms concern the expression, transcription, or translation of the genetic code into the phenotype, that is, the biological unique constitution and physical appearance of each individual. That explains the fact that we're not identical. These mechanisms act essentially through the activation or silencing of certain genes, that is, through a series of modifications. These changes in gene expression that do not involve changes to the underlying DNA sequence, we are talking here of a change in phenotype without a change in genotype, are now known to be precisely heritable. Epigenetic changes occurs at the chemical internal level, but, and this is what interests me, can also be influenced by several factors, including age, environment, lifestyle, and disease state. These changes may be reflected at various stages throughout a person's life and even in later generations. In the lecture I gave in the comparative literature department, which was called Epigenesis of the Text, it was last month, in order to explain what epigenetics is, I took the example of the text and its interpretations. To give an example of the relation between the genotype and the phenotype. Today I'll take another example from this wonderful book by Eva Jablonka and Marion Lamb, which is called Evolution in 4 Dimensions: Genetic, Epigenetic, Behavioral, and Symbolic. They use the metaphor of the musical score. So let me read from their book. So the first passage is a metaphor for the genetic paradigm, and then they move to the epigenetic one. So for the genetic one, think about a piece of music that is represented by a system of notes written on paper, a score. The score is copied repeatedly as it is passed on from one generation to the next. Very rarely, uncorrected mistakes occur during copying, and perhaps an impertinent copier sometimes make a tiny deliberate alteration. But with the exception of such small and rare changes, the piece of music is transmitted faithfully from generation to generation in the form of the written score. The relationship between the score and the music is analogous to the genotype-phenotype distinction. So according to the genetic paradigm, only the genotype, that is the score, is transmitted from one generation to the next. The phenotype is not. And the phenotype in the metaphor is the particular performance, the actual interpretation of the piece. Changes in the genotype are passed on. Changes in the phenotype, acquired characters, are not. Epigenetic. This was the situation until new ways of transmitting music were invented. The technologies of recording and broadcasting made it possible to transmit performances by recording them, editing them, copying them onto tapes or discs, and broadcasting them. Now, through these new technologies, the actual interpretations of the music can be transmitted as well as the written musical score. In terms of the genotype-phenotype analogy, the recording and broadcasting systems transmit the phenotypes of the pieces rather than the only genotypic instructions of the score. Okay? So the interpretations here again are transmitted with the score. In the second half of the 20th century, the concept of program dominated genetics. The idea of a program is exactly what is in question today, with the acknowledgement of the importance of epigenetic mechanisms. It is like as if interpretations were becoming as important as the score or as the initial text. This again, as we will see now, has major consequences on the notion of intelligence, as revealed by the recent neurobiological discoveries. Why am I interested in epigenetics? It is because brain's development is, for its most part, epigenetic, which means that innateness plays a minimal role in it. First of all, during the life of the fetus, most of the 100 billion neurons at work in the brain, as well as the innumerable synaptic connections that link them, are formed. under the influence of experiences lived in utero and later on during the first years of life, many of irrelevant or redundant connections are eliminated while others are consolidated. This is the work of epigenesis. This process does not only take place during the critical periods of development. Throughout life, the brain undergoes synaptic modifications imposed on it by experience and environment. Everything that we live, everything that we experience has an influence on the form of the brain. It is an epigenetic kind of development. That's why brain development continues long after birth and depends to a large extent on environmental and cultural factors. As the French neurobiologist Jean-Pierre Changeux constantly reminds us, the theory of epigenesis by synaptic selection and stabilization is the opposite of innatism. In their book, The Mind and the Brain, Neuroplasticity and the Power of Mental Force, Jeffrey Schwartz and Sharon Begley, authors, write, although it would be perfectly reasonable to posit that genes determine the brain's connections, just as a wiring diagram determines the connections on a silicon computer chip, that is a mathematical impossibility. As the Human Genome Project drew to a close in the early years of the new millennium, it became clear that humans have something like 35,000 different genes, but about half of them seem to be active in the brain. The brain, remember, has billions of nerve cells that make altogether trillions of connections. If each gene carried an instruction for a particular connection, we would quickly run out of instructions. Call it the genetic shortfall, too many synapses, too few genes. Our DNA is simply too paltry to spell out the wiring diagram for the human brain. So what is fascinating, according to me, is that in our body, we have clearly two lines of development. One is genetic, the other is epigenetic. And these two complexities are having a certain, difficult relationships that I will talk about now. So the genetic claim that development does not influence the passage from the genotype to the phenotype is no longer tenable today. The first analogy of the music thing is not acceptable any longer. This is why it is now impossible to separate embryology, development biology, and evolutionary biology. Adaptive factors of organisms other than natural selection are now recognized as playing a prime role in evolutionary processes. And this evolutionary dynamic is enriched by the contribution of epigenetics. Again, as Jean-Pierre Changeux points out, we observe an evolutionary paradox. He calls that evolutionary paradox that marks the discontinuity between brain complexity and genetic complexity, with brain complexity being far greater than genetic complexity. This discontinuity or nonlinear evolution between the increasing complexity of brain organization on the one hand and the apparent invariability of the DNA content on the other, again prevents us from calling on innatism. The brain has its own life and development, which do not depend entirely on genetic information. Clearly, the brain is more than a reflection of our genes. Synaptic development is never the mere implementation of a program or code. On the contrary, it includes the spontaneous activity in the nervous system in addition to activity provoked by interaction with the environment. One of the fundamental challenges in contemporary neurobiology is between program and individuation. That is, the elucidation of the still poorly understood relationship between the human genome and the phenotype of the brain. This relation opens the playing field, or the middle ground, between genetic determinism and the environmental selective imprint on the individual. Once again, only an epigenetic view of the shaping of neural connections enables a break with strict determinism. What are the consequences of such a situation on the notion of intelligence? On that point, Jean-Pierre Changeux very interestingly turns toward Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist. According to Changeux, and thank you to Changeux because I discovered that thanks to him, Bourdieu has anticipated the epigenetic turn and its effects on the definition of intelligence. In his book, Pascalian Meditations, Méditation Pascalienne, from 1997, Bourdieu proposes, first of all, to substitute the term conditionability for that of innatism. Conditionability is defined, I quote Bourdieu, as the natural capacity to acquire non-natural capacities, including cognitive capacities. It is defined in other terms as the capacity to form a habitus, and we know that habitus is the central term in Bourdieusian sociology. I quote from Pascalian Meditations. Bourdieu says, to deny the existence of acquired dispositions amounts to deny the existence of learning in the sense of the selective, durable transformation of the body through the reinforcement or weakening of synaptic connections. Such practical understanding requires a new form of analysis beyond mechanism or idealism, a materialist theory which examines action. And this is what the notion of habitus does. It restores to the agent a generating, unifying, constructing, classifying power, the capacity to construct social reality. So intelligence will be defined from that point on as this capacity to construct social reality. The concept of habitus in Bourdieu may be considered an early synonym for the contemporary concept of epigenesis that seems to adequately characterize the relationship between neurons and intelligence. Bourdieu sees neural plasticity as the condition of possibility for a strong interaction between the brain and the social. Neural plasticity, that is the capacity of neural connections to change form, increase or decrease in size and volume according to external solicitations or influences, is the very possibility of the inscription of the social within the body. The habitus is then defined as, I quote Bourdieu, a socialized subjectivity. That's why, from that point of view, intelligence can no longer be determined as genius, as an inborn set of abilities, or as a general pre-given and measurable factor. Intelligence, because it coincides with the habitus formation process, fashions itself and appears as a result and not as a point of departure. As Piaget very early and very rightly noticed, also anticipating the epigenetic turn and making a great use of the notion of epigenesis in his child psychology, intelligence, I quote Piaget, organizes the world in organizing itself. And I think this is very beautiful. The intelligence organizes the world in organizing itself. And to me, there are two very important books by Piaget, The Origins of Intelligence in Children, which appeared in the US in 1952, and Biology and Knowledge, which was translated in 1971. In that sense, we may consider that plasticity is what reconciles intelligence and the intellect. Such a vision of intelligence as plasticity, as self-formation, as second nature, hasn't ceased to be developed and refined in the most recent neurobiological research and discoveries. It is now possible to affirm that to root intelligence in the brain is not necessarily a reductionist gesture and happens to be a very different enterprise than 19th century brain measurements, craniometry, or even phrenology. IQ tests have certainly not disappeared, but it is now very clear that these tests are definitely unable to measure the impact of epigenetic mechanisms on cognition, culture, and the constitution of identities. The notion of innatism has, of course, not purely and simply disappeared. I'm not arguing that we have entered an era of pure biological constructivism. The epigenetic development of the brain would, of course, not be possible without or outside the genetic envelope with which it constantly interacts. The biological structure of the brain, the division between its regions, visual or auditory cortex, frontal lobes, temporal lobes, etc., are genetically determined. And this genetic envelope comprises many elements that we share with other species. In this sense, brain development is in part the consequence of biological evolution. But what is made manifest today is that the concept of biological evolution has to be pluralized. There are several evolutions in one, and we can speak of multiple encased evolutions: phylogenetic, ontogenetic, epigenetic, symbolic, at least 4, as Jablonka and Young are counting. Clearly, there is more to heredity than genes, and more to heredity than Darwinism, which is also something incredible. Epigenetic inheritance, for example, is very specific. It is reversible, which means that it can be interrupted, that it may cease, and as Jablonka and Young advocate, we have to approach it from the point of view of a renewed Lamarckism. It's so amazing to see that Lamarck is coming back today, and that we have to accept that in fact evolution is a kind of duet between Darwin and Lamarck. In conclusion, time has come to admit that induced and acquired changes also play a role in evolution. Inheritance, then, finds itself equally pluralized. There are several inheritances at work, which offers a richer, more complex view of evolution than the gene-based, one-dimensional view evoked yesterday. Just for fun, I checked the definition of behavioral epigenetics on Wikipedia. So yesterday we talked about behavioral genetics, you remember? So on Wikipedia, I just give you the first sentence. Behavioral genetics is the field that examines the role of genetic influences on animal, including human behavior. But now there is a science called behavioral epigenetics. So I read the definition, first sentence also from Wikipedia. Behavioral epigenetics is the field of study examining the role of epigenetics in shaping animal, including human behavior. It is an experimental science that seeks to explain how nurture shapes nature. It's a total reversal, where nature refers to biological heredity and nurture refers to virtually everything that occurs during the lifespan: social experience, diet and nutrition, and exposure to toxins. So this is Wikipedia. But it's interesting because it is a total reversal. Behavioral genetics, as we saw yesterday, was nature over nurture, and now we have the total inversion. If the human brain is more complex than any other animal brain, it is interesting to see that the anatomical and functional framework in which this superiority appears is, according again to Changeux, neither, I quote him, neither rational nor optimal. The human brain is not a piece of wax that would passively receive imprints from the outside, nor is it an ideally organized machine that would capture objective traces of the social and the historical. The very anatomy of the human brain bears witness to an erratic evolutive past rather than to an optimal functional necessity or to any intelligent design. Intelligence is not intelligently designed. In developing itself, so what Changeux means is that in developing itself, the cerebral cortex in the human has wrapped up and pushed deep inside limbic and thalamic architectures that had a major behavioral signification and role in previous species. You know, the brain, there's this big cortex like that. And within, I mean, in the interior of the brain, there are the regions that are called the prehistorical brain. And evolution it's true that he said that the neocortex, while developing, has pushed all these old things inside. The arbitrary, according to Changeux, this is the product of arbitrary circumstances, because the organism has been confronted through its evolution to the contingency of nature and has preserved a sort of functional and organizational unreason in its cerebral architecture. I quote again from Changeux, "Unreason is inscribed in our neurons, just like our capacity to reason. And the most evolved structure of the brain, the neocortex, is only a surface." This brings me back to Bourdieu, who proposes an equivalence between disposition and exposition. Intelligence consists in a series of dispositions, just like the cortex of our brain, which is exposed to the outside. So intelligence consists in a series of dispositions forming the habitus, as we said, and these dispositions, Bourdieu says, are expositions, that is, expositions in the sense of something which is posed outside, but also as something which is exposed, exposures. Expositions and exposures, a quote from Pascalian Meditations again. One could, through Heideggerian play on words, say that this position is exposition. It is because the brain, at different degrees, it is because the brain is, at different degrees, exposed, put into play, into danger in the world, confronted with the risk of emotion, hurt, suffering, sometimes death, and thus obliged to take the world seriously, and nothing is more serious than emotion, which touches on the innermost depth of our organic dispositions, that it can acquire dispositions which are themselves opening through the world, that is, to the very structures of the social world of which they are the embodied form. I didn't know that Bourdieu was so profound. It was a revelation for me. When he says that in fact, there can be no cerebrality without the emotional exposure of the brain to the world. I think this is very, very amazing because it is exactly what it is. And Bourdieu had this anticipation. He didn't know anything at the time about the new discoveries. Okay, so I'm going to drink some water, excuse me. And this is the middle points of my talk. In a certain sense, we might stop there and consider that the problem is solved, that intelligence is not genetically determined, that, we have to put an end to IQ tests, to brain measurements, etc. We might show that everything I demonstrated yesterday is now obsolete, and we might think that the epigenetic paradigm would allow us, as I just mentioned, to reconcile intelligence and the intellect. That the dramatic changes undergone by current molecular biology might correct the philosophical vision of this discipline as the pure and simple servant of power, as a pure and simple synonym for biopower or technoscience. Is not plasticity the ideal linchpin between the biological and the symbolic? Does it not characterize at the same time a natural and empirical economy, that of the brain, and also the very openness, exposure of this economy to all its symbolic and social adventures? Does it not authorize a possible identity between biological development and personal history, between materiality and the absence of any strict determinism? Does it not induce, in that sense, a new deconstruction of sovereignty, of police, of control? For years, I have explored the concept of plasticity because of what it says about form, bestowing form, receiving form, exploding form. Isn't plasticity precisely the form of intelligence, this metamorphic power that tests and measurements had failed to discover? Is not plasticity the enemy to formlessness? It would then be possible, at last, thanks to plasticity, to open a dialogue between philosophy and neurobiology, and to get beyond the fear of innatism or automatism, and to put an end to the frontal conflict, to the tortoise I was talking about yesterday. This occupied me for years and years to demonstrate that plasticity was the solution, and that the dialogue between neurobiology and continental philosophy could take place, at least. And all these hopes were, I thought, summarized in one question: what should we do with our brain? To me, this title, the title of my book, it was published in 2004, this question was: we are responsible for our brain is plastic, and we philosophers have to answer the question of our responsibility with our own intelligence. Because intelligence is what we do. It's not something that is innate, this is something that we fashion. Again, we might stop here with, with the expression of these ideals. And when I thought about the topic I would develop here for these lectures, it gave me the opportunity to express a kind of despair, which I will develop now. Something I didn't really want to see or say, that is the total failure of my book and of my hopes. Unfortunately, or is it fortunately, the recent developments in artificial intelligence woke me up from my non-dogmatic slumber. It was a violent shock for me to realize, just a few months after the book came out, that some of what I thought to be its important conclusions were inaccurate, that I was wrong, that the book should be revised, and perhaps even entirely rewritten. This suspicion brutally came to me when I read an article about the most recent computational architectures, and particularly about IBM's design of a totally new type of chip, the neurosynaptic chip. The title of the article was eloquent. IBM's neurosynaptic chip mimics human brain. In clear, IBM was releasing a neurosynaptic computation chip that was able to simulate the neurons and synapses of the brain, in other terms, to simulate plasticity. Up until now, most computer chips had employed a von Neumann type architecture, the mathematics-based system at the core of almost every computer built since 1948, and that executes instructions in series. So with that type of computer, it was very easy to say, no, come on, our brain is plastic and the machines are not. But by comparison, the synaptic chip is made of different neurosynaptic cores, or correlates, they call that function autonomously in a non-synchronic way, so that those which are not solicited remain inactive, thus resulting in a lower energy use. If it is said to mimic the brain, it is because this chip allows interactions between neurons, the elements of the calculus in the computer, synapses, the memory, and axons, communications with other parts of the chip. The second reason is that the electronic synaptic components are capable of varying connection strength between two neurons in a manner analogous to that seen in biological systems. The system develops what we might call its own experience. Could it be that plasticity was programmable then? And if and when plasticity becomes programmable, is it still plasticity? What remained of my affirmations in the book concerning the irreducibility of the brain to a cybernetic system? Allow me to quote myself here. I wrote, "Plasticity explains the fruitlessness of the well-known technological metaphors that have been used to characterize brain functioning, like, of course, that of the computer, or the comparison between brain and computer is not pertinent. Then I had to admit that I was wrong again, and that plastic intelligence was perhaps just a chip. In 2011, Dharmendra Modha, founder of IBM's cognitive computing group at IBM Research, it's fascinating, IBM, developed with his team the first cognitive chip, thus concretizing the Synapse project, synapse for systems of neuromorphic, adaptive, plastic, scalable electronics. The ambition was right from the start to develop low-power electronic neuromorphic computers that could scale to biological levels. More recently, a still improved chip came to light. It's called True North, made of 4,096 neurosynaptic cores and able to simulate around 1 million neurons. I quote Modha. If we think of today's von Neumann computers as akin to the left brain, fast, symbolic, number crunching calculators, then True North can be likened to the right brain, that is slow, sensory, pattern recognizing machines, emotional brain. True North correlates are designed for sensory applications that include things like artificial noses, artificial ears, artificial eyes that are adaptable and can rewire synapses based on their inputs. So it is clear that artificial intelligence has also made its epigenetic revolution, inventing devices that are able to transform themselves, modify themselves, and integrate their own changes. In 50 years of artificial intelligence, we have moved from the information processing view of the brain that marked the beginning of IA in the 50s, then to knowledge representations from the 60s and 70s, then to neural networks in the 80s, to end between the 90s and up to now with embodiment systems, accomplishing the goal of grounding language in sensory-motor interactions. Such a history may also be seen as leading us from, leading us from artificial narrow intelligence, which is ANI, sometimes also referred to as weak AI, to artificial general intelligence, AGI, or strong AI, and then to artificial super intelligence, ASI. We are currently still running on ANI for the most part. We are amazed by everything that happens today, but it's only the first moment. It's only ANI. Because ANI machines are machines that equal or exceed human intelligence at only a specific thing. Our phones, our computers, chess play programs, even Google self-driving cars are still ANI systems. AGI refers to a computer that is as smart as a human across the board and can perform any intellectual task that a human being can. As for ASI, that is super intelligence, I will let Nick Bostrom, Swedish philosopher who teaches at Oxford, speak. By a super intelligence, he says, we mean an intellect that is much smarter than the best human brains in practically every field, including scientific creativity, general wisdom, and social skills. This definition leaves open how the super intelligence is implemented. It could be a digital computer, an ensemble of network computers, cultured cortical tissue, or what have you. It also leaves open whether the super intelligence is conscious and has subjective experiences. So, as I said, we're currently halfway between ANI and AGI, and the epigenetic cybernetic achievement that is actively looked for today is obviously a new, unexpected structure of electronic subjectivity. Definitely, plasticity is programmable, manipulable, And there is no way we can oppose it a new tortoise formation, because it would immediately simulate it, so that the initial tortoise wouldn't be able to know the exact reason of its own presence on the front, because what front? But is artificial plasticity still plasticity, one will ask? It looks like it, but it is perhaps just a name for a pure calculus, something that has nothing to do with natural plasticity. A magnitude, again, instead of an intensity. It is true that we often think of singularity as being only a quantitative phenomenon. This is what Slavoj Žižek did the other day. He referred to singularity as only something quantitative, and I think he's wrong. Ray Kurzweil, in his famous book, The Singularity is Near, of course, presents singularity in terms of magnitude. So what is singularity? Singularity, Kurzweil affirms, is, I quote, an English word meaning a unique event with, well, singular implications. The word was adopted by mathematicians to denote a value that transcends any finite limitation, such as the explosion of magnitude that results when dividing a constant by a number that gets closer and closer to zero. The next field to adopt the word was astrophysics. If a massive star undergoes a supernova explosion, its remnants eventually collapses to the point of apparently zero volume and infinite density, and a singularity is created at its center. So a singularity is a kind of hole or deflagration. The development of artificial intelligence will soon create such an explosive event, a singularity. And Kurzweil constantly insists on the exponential growth of computing capacities and speed. The figures are vertiginous in the book. I won't quote them because it would be too boring, but I mean, this is really interesting to read. And he also speaks of a paradigm shift in terms of quantity. This is true. I quote, "The rate of the paradigm shift, technical innovation, is accelerating, now doubling every decade." He also sets a date, the 2020s, at which, I quote, "intelligence indistinguishable from that of biological humans will become a reality." So he says that in about 10 years from now. Nevertheless, what I want to argue is that the shift is also qualitative. It's not only a question of quantity. Otherwise, we could develop the same thing as yesterday and criticize this in saying this is just measurement, etc. But the problem is that the shift is also qualitative. The singularity will also be that of the plasticity of machines. So yes, it is plasticity that is at stake, and not only a quantity. Human intelligence, says Kurzweil, has a certain amount of plasticity. That is, an ability to change its structure, more so than had been understood. But the problem is that machines to come will also be plastic, more and more plastic. They will augment their capacities, but not only, again, in the sense of mere quantitative addition. They will be capable of changing themselves. I quote Kurzweil, "Once machines achieve the ability to design and engineer technology as humans do, only at far higher speeds and capacities, they will have access to their own designs, source code, and the ability to manipulate them." Just as we manipulate genetics, as he says. Yeah, it's interesting. Further, machines will be able to reformulate their own designs. Again, we see how quantity and quality are intimately tied together. So if we go back to the discussion we had yesterday, yes, machines can produce intensities. And so what Bergson says is also collapsing. The problem for me has never been, will machines replace us? Or can a computer be intelligent? Can it simulate a brain, do better than us, do better without us? I, of course, share some of Hawking's fears, how not to share them. When, as he recently told the BBC, I quote, I'm sure you saw that in the newspapers, the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. This is perhaps true, but strangely enough, though, my philosophical obsession is not related to that fear. My own anxiety pertains to the possibility that plasticity might not exist, that it might never have existed, that it might only have been the apparently emancipating name for an oppressive reality, that of the passivity of human intelligence, always ready to let itself be constituted and captured by mirrors, tests, measurements, computers. Is there any difference in the end between them? Aren't all of them the orthopedic shapes of the shapelessness, the formlessness of intelligence, of its void? I thematized yesterday the philosophical reaction against psychology and psychometry, against the desire to form the formlessness. But after all, formlessness is perhaps all there is, and philosophy is perhaps only a fantasy that there might be something else. The intellect itself is perhaps another formless form. And philosophy may, after all, just be a result of the originary divorce of the mind from its own abilities. It was also during that time of doubt that I watched the movie Her, a 2013 science fiction film written and directed by Spike Jonze. The film follows Theodore Twombly, Joaquin Phoenix, a man who develops a relationship with Samantha, Scarlett Johansson, an intelligent computer operating system personified through a female voice. I found this film absolutely excellent, fascinating, and it provoked the same type of shock as my learning about the synaptic ship. Samantha is precisely a plastic computer that adapts to its owner, that responds to him, makes love with him, has experiences, and shares unique life events with him. Samantha is not a robot in the usual sense of the term. She is a voice, she is a body, she is a brain. But then, in the end, she appears as what she really is, an impersonal murmur, a universal device, shared by several, devoid of any self, a technological whore. Plasticity and flexibility are perhaps in the end one and the same. And Theodore is left alone with a mirage of his own stupidity, just as I was with my book. I am sometimes, and this is my conclusion, which is not really a conclusion, as I said, I am sometimes asked about what I think of the Human Brain Project, a large 10-year scientific research project established in 2013, coordinated by Henry Macram from the École Polytechnique in Lausanne, and largely funded by the European Union. The Human Brain Project is the European version of the American BRAIN initiative, BRAIN for Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, also referred to as the Brain Activity Map Project, announced by President Obama in 2013. And the goal of all that is to map the activity of every neuron in the human brain using big data. The program will develop information and communications technology platforms in 6 main areas: neuroinformatics, brain simulation, high-performance computing, medical informatics, neuromorphic computing, and neurorobotics. Again, the goal is to propose in the end a complete and detailed cartography of the human brain. The Human Brain Project will in part develop the results of another project which is called the Blue Brain Project, hence my title, also founded by Macram at Lausanne in 2005. So first of all, there was the Blue Brain Project that transformed into the Human Brain Project. So why the Blue Brain Project? Because the simulations were carried out on a Blue Gene supercomputer built by IBM, and they called it the Blue Brain. Blue Brain is the name of a computer. And now both projects, the Blue Brain and Human Brain, are fused, and they are in the same place, the biotech campus in Geneva. So allow me a brief description of the Blue Brain before I conclude. I'm sorry it's very boring, but I think this is something we all have to know. The initial goal of Blue Brain is a simulation of a rat neocortical column, which is considered by some researchers to be the smallest functional unit of the neocortex. And they did simulate this column. In humans, such a column is about 2 millimeters tall, has a diameter of 0.5 millimeter, and contains about 60,000 neurons. Rat neocortical columns are very similar in structure, but contain only 10,000 neurons. Between 1995 and 2005, Macram mapped the types of neurons and their connections in the rat column. So now we have the exact simulation of a whole column. The first artificial cellular neocortical column of 10,000 cells was built in 2008. In July 2011, a cellular mesocircuit of 100 neocortical columns with 1 million cells in total was built. A cellular entire rat brain is planned for 2017. Finally, a cellular human brain is predicted possible by 2023, equivalent to 10,000 rat brains with a total of 100 billion cells. The goal, once again, is to simulate a whole neocortex, which in human brains consists of about 1 million cortical columns. So they start with the rat columns, and then they hope that they will be able to map an entire neocortex. Is it a joke or not? Markram sometimes affirms that the goal of all goals is that in the end, Blue Brain will become aware of itself. I won't mention here the numerous critiques addressed to Macron, and particularly to the Human Brain Project by many scientists. It is clear that human brain can be regarded as the new version of human genome. It is seen by many as an attempt to sequence human intelligence in producing, again, a cybernetic superintelligence. So we tried to sequence the genome, and now we would try to sequence the brain. But anyway, this exists, and it is very serious. All of a sudden, it seemed to me that the epigenetic turn in the history of intelligence was turning against intelligence. And here we have the problem that I was talking about in the beginning. For some time, I thought that what was left for me was to rewrite my book and call it Rat Race, or, with not much hope for an answer, what can we do with their blue brain? Thank you for your attention.